Hello everyone, today I want you to imagine a world with no printed books, no newspapers, not even the printed labels on the things we buy. A world where every single word, every single letter had to be written by hand. For a very long time, this was the reality in Europe. So, in this chapter, we are going to explore how print came to Europe and how it completely changed the world. Let's begin.
Just think about this question for a moment. What would it mean if every book you've ever read had to be copied out by hand? How would new ideas spread? How would we learn about history? You see, for hundreds of years in Europe, this wasn't just an imaginary question. It was a fact of life.
And this brings us to our first section, the world of manuscripts. Before printing, every book was a handwritten manuscript, and this had a huge impact on society.
Now, the word manuscript comes from Latin. Manu means hand, and script means writing, so it literally means written by hand. These books were often written on something called vellum, which was a very fine parchment made from animal skin. Scribes, who were usually monks in monasteries, would spend months, sometimes even years, just to copy one single book.
But you know, this beautiful work had some very big problems. First, vellum was very expensive, so the books themselves were like treasures. The process was also extremely slow. This meant books were not only rare, but also big and heavy. And because of all this, only the very rich, the aristocratic and the church, could afford to own them. So the main thing to understand here is that knowledge was a luxury. It was not for ordinary people.
So what started the change? Well, the idea for this big revolution didn't actually start in Europe. It traveled slowly along the old trade routes all the way from the east.
Let's look at this timeline. For centuries, the Silk Road was used to bring goods from China to Europe. And in the 11th century, a very important material arrived. Paper. Paper was much, much cheaper than vellum. Then, much later, in 1295, the famous explorer Marco Polo came back to Italy after spending many years in China. He brought back amazing stories, but also very important knowledge about Chinese technology.
And one of the most important technologies he brought knowledge of was woodblock printing. This method had been used in China for a very long time. It's quite a simple idea, really. You take a block of wood and carve out a whole page with pictures and words. Then you put ink on the block and press it onto a sheet of paper. This way you could make many copies from just one wooden block.
Now, this new technology of woodblock printing came to Europe at the perfect time. Just as people were learning about it, a new hunger for books and for reading was growing all across the continent.
So who were all these people who wanted more books? Well, firstly, new universities were opening up, and students needed cheaper copies of their textbooks. Secondly, merchants and businessmen needed to keep written records for their trade. And thirdly, in the towns and cities, more and more ordinary people were learning to read, and they were eager for books.
Because so many people wanted books, making them started to become a proper business. Booksellers began to open workshops and would hire many scribes to write for them. And once woodblock printing became known, these workshops started using it to print things like playing cards, religious pictures, and short books for this new market.
But there was a problem. Even with these new methods, it was just not possible to make books fast enough for everyone who wanted one. The old ways of doing things were simply not enough anymore.
If we compare the two methods, woodblock printing was definitely better than handwriting. You could make multiple copies, and it was faster and cheaper. But you still had to carve an entire page on a block of wood. Imagine doing that for a book with hundreds of pages. It was still a very slow process, especially for long books.
Now, this is a very important point to remember. Just because woodblock printing arrived, manuscripts did not disappear. Oh no. For the rich aristocrats, a beautiful handwritten book on vellum was still a status symbol. They actually looked down on printed books and thought they were, in their words, cheap vulgarities. So for a long time, both handwritten manuscripts and printed books existed together, but for different kinds of buyers.
So Europe was at a very crucial point. The demand for books was like a huge wave, and it was growing bigger and bigger. Woodblock printing was helping a little bit, but it was just too slow for what was needed. A much faster, much more efficient way to print was desperately required. So all of the pieces were in place. Europe now had cheaper paper from China, it had the basic idea of printing using woodblocks, and most importantly, it had a massive number of people who wanted to read. The stage was perfectly set for a big revolution.
This quote from our textbook really explains the situation perfectly. It wasn't just a small want, it was a great need. Everyone felt this pressure. Society was ready for a new invention, something that could make knowledge available to many more people, and not just the rich.
And that breakthrough, that amazing invention, was just around the corner. It would come from Germany, from a man named Johann Gutenberg. His invention of the printing press would use all the things we have just discussed, the paper, the idea of printing, and the huge demand, to start an information revolution that is still going on today. But that story is for our next class.